In this video, we're going to go through setting up your authentication system. So we're going to create the views and we're going to adjust what we already have in our authentication controller from the last tutorial in order to process that login. The first thing we're going to need to do is create our login form. In order just to go back over how these map together, I'm going to open up my authentication controller here, and you can see we have our two functions or two methods inside here, one called index and one called login. Now, because we want any user to log in, we're going to focus on this login function or method just now. So we're going to create the view here. So remember, in the last tutorial we discussed about how return view goes into the folder for the controller, so in this case authentication, and then grabs the login template. So in order for us to create our login form, we're going to open up this login.cs HTML file and we're going to create our login form in here. Now remember, we're using Bootstrap, so if you're not too familiar with Bootstrap, then go ahead and have a look at the Bootstrap tutorial, which is also on this channel, or also have a look at getbootstrap.com and then click on documentation. So we're going to start by creating a simple form. Now remember, we need to have these name tags set up on our form elements. So in this case I'm creating an input which is going to accept the username. So we need to have this name on here. I'm going to start off by adding some blank values, but we may adjust this later on down the line. Now the reason why I'm grouping elements is because I'm actually going to be creating labels to go alongside these. I'll show you how they work as I get to them. And also, just while we're looking at the password field here, there may be, or there is, a different type of field that we can set here. Now the reason why I'm leaving it as text at the moment is so we can see what's actually happening on the screen when we go to submit this form. So I'm going to go ahead and add some labels. So 4 needs to match the name, so in this case it's username, and we're going to just give it the name username, like so. And I'm going to go into the second form group and I'm going to add in a label for password. And we can see that Visual Studio, or the Visual Studio ID, is prompting me and actually completing some of this code for me. So it is quite quick to develop with Visual Studio when you get used to it. So now I have my form. Now I'm missing my form tag. Now there's a reason why I'm missing that, and I'm going to show you why in a second. So I'm going to show you how we deal with this slightly differently in ASP.NET Core. What I am going to do just first of all, before I go ahead and add that form tag, is I'm going to add a button, and I'm just going to say login. Okay, so that's going to prompt the user to log in. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the way that we deal with the form now around these fields is slightly different in ASP.NET Core, or even in ASP.NET. So what we're going to do is, rather than writing a traditional form tag as would start like so, what we're going to do is we're going to use Razor's logic, or Razor template logic, in order to generate this form and allow ASP to accept posts from it. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to write an @ symbol, which is an indicator to show that it's the start of Razor logic. I'm going to write the word using. It's a HTML form, so we're going to say @HTML.begin form, and that's going to allow us to begin the form code. Now inside here, I'm going to open and close some regular brackets, and then inside these we're going to have 3 parameters. We're going to have the method that we're going to send this data to. So in this case, we're going to send it to a login method. We're going to have the controller that we're going to send this data to. So it's administration. So that's the administration controller. Now notice in this case I haven't put the word controller in there. That doesn't need to be there. It just needs to be the name of the controller itself, in this case administration. Okay, then the last parameter that we're going to add in here is what we're going to do with the form when we click the button. So remember, our button is just called login, so you can see that on line 23 of our code just now. But what are we going to do when we click that button? So what we're going to say is form method is a post method. So we're going to send this data when we click the button, and we're going to allow the system to pick up that data using a post method. Now we're going to open and close some curly braces. The opening brace needs to be right at the top of the form. The closing brace needs to be at the end of our form, like so. Now I can now indent this just to make sure it's nice and clear that I've got my form and I've got the content within the form in here. Now I am just going to adjust this button slightly to add in some bootstrap styling onto it. So I'm going to add a class, and I'm going to call it a button, and it's going to be a default button for now. Again, familiarise yourself with Bootstrap if you don't know this just now. This is just styling, so it's just going to make it look a bit tidier when it's on the screen. I'm showing you what's actually happening. I'm also going to adjust my inputs. So I'm going to add a class, and I'm just going to call it a form control. And you can see Visual Studio again is prompting me with some Bootstrap helpers here. So again, it's handy for me to use Visual Studio as an IDE. I'm going to copy this class because it's exactly the same for the other control, which in this case is an input again. And I'm going to save that form now. To make things slightly tighter, I'm just going to adjust the header at the top of this form. So I'm just going to change this, and I'm going to get rid of that class there. I'm going to leave it as login, and I'm going to change this paragraph, the content within this paragraph tag here, just to make it my own. And in there I'm going to say authorization is required to access this system. You can have that as whatever you want, it's just to give a clear indication that we're now visiting this page. So if I now go ahead and run that, okay, so this is now my store app. I've not done anything special with this, it's the standard store app, standard home page. What I'm going to do is navigate to the Authentication Controller and then the login method. And you can see now I now have my login form. So we can see I have my login header, my paragraph, username, password fields, and also my login button. Now my button isn't displaying quite right, so I'm just going to go back in and just adjust this ever so slightly to get it to style properly. So I'm just going to adjust the class on this button just slightly, just because I'm used to using an older version of Bootstrap, which it seems the styling no longer exists there. So I'm going to just change this slightly. I'm going to change this class to just button primary. And again, we can see that the ID has popped up to give me a prompt for that. I'm going to just stop my application, restart it. So again, I'm going to go to my Authentication Controller and then my login method. And we can now see I've got a blue login button, which looks a bit better for us. Okay, so now what we've got is we've got our form set up, and we're telling it to post itself back to the Authentication Controller, and then an action within there or a method within there which is going to deal with that post. So I'm just going to try and log in. So I'm just going to put a mark and then password, like so. I'm going to click login, and we can see that I just get a white screen. That's because we're not actually dealing with any post data at the minute. So the next thing we need to do is just adjust our controller so that it deals with this post information. To keep my code nice and tidy, what I'm going to do is pop into the Authentication Controller, and I'm going to write first of all the function or the method which is going to process the login itself. So to do that, I'm going to pop inside the Authentication Controller class, and I'm going to create a new function. So I'm going to call it process login. Now I'm going to adjust this slightly because I only want to be able to use it within this controller. So what I'm going to say is private bool, because we want either a true or false response from this login. And then within there I'm going to allow it to accept two parameters. First of which is going to be the username, second of which is going to be our password. So these are the two things that we're going to check against the database, check they exist and they are correct. Next thing I'm going to do is create a new instance of our users model. The reason why I need to do this is because I'm going to use the users model to check this information in the database itself. So to do that, I'm going to say users. I'm going to call it login data. So this is just the name that I'm setting for it. And I'm going to say new users. You can see on this line of code now I've got a couple of errors which are indicated by that squiggly red line at the bottom. Now the reason I've got these is just because I haven't loaded my models into this file. So why I need to load my models is so I can communicate with the database but also we're calling the name of the model here. So what we need to do is at the top of our file, we need to say using, and then the name of your application, which in this case is store, and then just models, like so. Okay. Now you can see at the top of this file, and this is something that will help you as you go throughout this whole development process, is I've got 4 files here, or 4 using statements, which are all greyed out. Now what I can do is I can click on this light bulb again here, and I can say remove unnecessary usings, and you can see it's highlighted 4 it's going to remove. So I click that, it removes them, and we get 2 nice lines of code rather than the 5 that we had previously. Okay, so now we can see back to this line, so we're now on line 22. You can see those errors have gone. You can see that if I hover over this, I've got class, store, models and users, which is what we want. Now I have actually got another error here. The reason I've got this is because this function expects a boolean response. So by boolean we mean true or false. So at the minute I've got no boolean response, so what I could do just to rectify this fairly quickly is just say return true, and you can see that's repaired that error. Now the issue with doing this is that now, even if the user doesn't exist or hasn't been validated, this is going to log them in because we're saying that the login's true. Okay, so we're going to leave that there for now, but it's important to remember we are going to come back and change this, because at the minute this isn't going to help us in terms of checking our authentication or checking and authenticating a user. So back to the code that we need to add to this. Okay, so what we've got is a new instance of the users model. So what we're going to do in here is we're now going to use this to check that that user actually exists, and we're going to validate them. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by creating a new login object. So we're going to say var login obj, which is short for login object, equals underscore context, which is our context. We're then going to say dot users, which is our model, dot where, so this is our where clause, and then we're going to check to see that parameter, the parameter called username, equals the username we pass it. So this here is mapping with this here, you can see as I hover over it. And we're also going to check that our password from our model or from our database equals the parameter we pass it called password. So again, this maps within, you can see as I hover over it, it highlights that. Now what I want to return from this is I'm just going to go ahead and just reformat the code just ever so slightly. What I want to return from this is just a single result. So I want to see whether that user exists or not. So I'm just going to pop onto another line, and I'm going to say single or default, and I'll point you towards the documentation for this in the links at the bottom of this video, so you can get a better understanding of what this is actually doing. And then what I'm going to do is write a simple if statement, which is going to check that that user actually exists. So I'm going to say if login obj or login object does not equal null, so i.e. we have a result that user exists, then we're going to move that return true inside here. Otherwise, what's going to happen is we're going to return false. Now, just to show you how we can tie this up just ever so slightly, we don't actually need this else statement here. What we can do is entirely get rid of that, and obviously if we hit this return, it's going to return true first. So in this case, if we don't have a result, then return false. You'll notice on this bit of code that I've got here that my underscore context is actually kicking out an error just now. So what I need to do, and what I've missed doing actually, is just adding something to the top of this controller which will allow me to load this in. So I'm going to add what's called a constructor method, but first of all I'm going to add in the ability to store this context so it can be used throughout the whole controller. So first of all, I know that I want to create it so it's read only, because I just want to load it, I don't want to do anything with it particularly. So I'm going to start with private read only. It's my default context, which is what we set up in the last tutorial. So if you haven't watched that, you'll need to watch that before you continue with this video. And I'm going to use a shortcut. I'm going to use a shorter name just called underscore context, and I'm going to refer to that throughout the rest of this controller. So now I've got that, what I'm going to do is create what's called a constructor method. A constructor method is something which is just loaded every time I load this controller. So it's the first thing that's ever loaded in the background. A constructor doesn't have to have anything physically happening on the screen, it doesn't have to have any physical output. It can just be to load some settings or to load something from the background that this controller requires. So I'm going to start with just putting in the word public, and I'm going to name the method the exact same thing as a controller. Now this is important, the constructor needs to be named the same as a controller, however it needs to be the full name in this case. So I'm going to say Authentication Controller. I'm going to pass in the default context. And then I'm going to assign context, which is now global and is available in our whole controller, the value of context from default context here. I'm going to save that file. So now if I scroll back down to my previous bit of code, you can see that I've now got my underscore context, the squiggly line has gone. You'll also notice that now that I've got rid of the squiggly line underneath the underscore context, I've now got a red squiggly line underneath where. Now the reason why I've got this is because earlier on I removed a using, and the using that I removed was using link. Link is just a component that adds native data querying capabilities to .NET languages. So in this case it's going to allow us to query the database without having to write any SQL, MySQL or any other database query language. So to repair this, what I can do is go right to the top of the file and I can add in using link, link being spelled L-I-N-Q, or I can click and hover and I can use what the light bulb suggests. Again, this is a great part of the Visual Studio IDE, and it's going to let me repair that itself by clicking this here. Okay, so we can see that's now been repaired. So that is now our very basic login check in place. Just going back to the top of this function now, so I created it and called it process login. The reason why I've created this is just to shorten the code in our actual function, which is going to process the login itself. So in this case, this is a private function, and what private means is that we can only access this and its properties within this controller itself. So I can't now call process login in any other controller. So I couldn't, for example, in my home controller, use the process login function. I can only use it inside this controller. The next step for me is going to be to create the actual login functionality itself. So what I mean by that is what's actually going to happen when I click that login button. This is where the program is going to send the user and where it's going to process this data now. So to do that, I'm going to create a new function. It's going to be an asynchronous function, and it's going to provide the ability to process a task. Now I want this function to return a result, so I'm going to say iActionResult, and then I'm going to give it a name. Now the name I'm going to give it should match my template. So previously when I created the login.cshtml file or my login template or view, then I created a method or said that it was going to post to the method called login. So I'm going to leave it as login. I'm going to pass in the model, so in this case it was called users. So I'm going to say users, and I'm going to call it my user model. Okay, so that's just a name that I can call it. I'm going to use this user model now throughout this function or method. So this is now the start of my method. So inside here, what I'm going to do is write a simple if statement. However, I'm going to make use of my process login function here. So I'm going to say process login, and I'm going to expect the model to pass in both the username and the password. So I'm going to say user model dot username, and in my second parameter, user model dot password, like so. Now this is going to have curly braces just like any other if statement, and then inside here what I'm going to do is create what's called a claim. Before I do that, I'm just going to rectify an issue again which has come as part of me removing those usings earlier on in the file. So you can see I've got my task iActionResult, and underneath I've got a red squiggly line, which again means there's an issue here somewhere. So I'm again going to use this light bulb. I'm going to click the down arrow and I'm going to use its top suggestion, which is that I add in using system, threading and tasks. Okay, you can see that's now been rectified. So we're going to create what's called a claims-based authorization. What I'll do is I'll add another link to the bottom of this video which will explain in a bit more detail about claims-based authorization. But basically what this is going to allow us to do is to tell the application that the user has actually logged in. So I'm going to create a new claim. So I'm going to say var, which is a variable. I'm going to call it claim to keep it nice and simple. I'm going to add in a list element and I'm going to call it claim. And then I'm going to open and close some curly braces. Now when you add this you might get an error. Now what I've done just before I've added this in is I've just added in using system security claims, and I've also added in system collections generic because we're going to need that to use list. Okay, so these were possibly things that were removed earlier on in the tutorial, but we do actually need them again now, so we're going to add them back in. Okay, so now we've got that there, we're going to create a new claim, and we're going to call it, we're going to create a new claim, and we're going to set the claim. So I'm going to add in a claim type, and I'm going to set the claim type to name. I'm now going to use my user model, and I'm going to apply the username against that. Okay, you can see that's now fine. All the red squiggly lines have gone for us, and that's now our correct claim set up. Now I'm going to create a new variable, and I'm going to call it user identity, and this is going to store whether we're actually logged in or not. So user identity equals new claims identity, and in this case it's going to be a claim, which is linking back to our variable here, so you can see that's now highlighted. And we're going to store in here whether we are logged in or not, so we're just going to call it login, like so. We're now going to load in our claims principal. We're just going to call it principal, so it's a new instance of a claims principal. And say claims principal, and we're going to call it user identity, which matches our variable name on line 39 here. After that, because we're using an asynchronous method with a task and we're expecting a result, in order for this error here to go, what we need to do is give it an await operator. So you can see here it's listing the error as this async method lacks await operators and will run synchronously. What an asynchronous method is something that runs and needs a response to say it's done. So to give it its await, what we're going to do is type in the word await. We're going to say HTTP context, and we're going to ask it to sign in. So sign in async. We're going to use a cookie here, and the reason we're going to use a cookie is so it retains that login, so that we can navigate throughout the protected areas without having to log in again and again. So we're going to say cookie authentication defaults authentication scheme, and it's going to be new claims principal, and it's going to use our user identity. Okay, now we can see again we're getting a couple of squiggly lines here, which means we're missing a couple of other things usually used in fact at the top of this controller. So we're going to again use our light bulb, and it's going to help us to add this in. So what we're missing is using Microsoft ASP.NET Core authentication cookies. So if we pop that in, we go on sign in async. Again, we're missing something here, so we can see using Microsoft ASP.NET Core authentication, and we'll pop that in. Now remember, we're still inside this process login at the minute, so remember this whole part here is just a method which is being run. We're passing in two parameters, a username and a password, and we're waiting to see if this evaluates to true. So remember our process login function, which is here, gives a boolean response, so either true or false. So in order to get inside this if statement, we need this to evaluate to true. So at the moment we're only going to get in here and carry out all of these steps. So all of these steps inside this if statement if the user actually exists in the database and their username and password match. So once we've set up the fact that they're logged in, so we've set up our cookie. So once we've actually checked that they're logged in, what we need to do is redirect them back to somewhere else. Now, what I'm going to suggest we do here is create another controller so that we can see that they are protected from that area if they're not logged in, and if they are logged in, they can go into that area. So I'm going to write a redirect, but at the moment we don't have a controller for this, so we're going to have to create the controller next. So I'm going to say we're going to redirect to admin. Okay, so this is going to redirect us to the admin controller when they log in. Okay, we can see we have got an error, but the reason we've got that error is because we haven't actually set up an admin controller. So the next step for us is to create an admin controller. So I'm going to do that just by copying and pasting our home controller. So I'm going to copy it, click on controllers, I'm going to paste it straight in there. Now I'm going to rename it, and I'm going to call it admin controller. So this is going to be our admin area. And then I'm also going to adjust inside the file I'm just going to get rid of some of these unneeded methods for now. So I'm going to say public index, we're going to return a view. So I've just missed my iActionResult from the start of this function name. There we go. So iActionResult index. So again, what's going to happen is when we visit admin in the address bar /index or just admin, which is the root of the controller, it's going to show me the view in there. Now we need to again create our views folder. So I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it admin, which is the name of the controller, and I'm just going to steal this home index for now. So I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to paste it straight in to my admin, and I'm going to tweak it, say welcome to admin area. What we have currently is our authentication controller, which now has a login function, and it has a function called process login, which is called within our login function. Visual Studio at the moment is asking me to change the signature of this function. Now the reason why is because this is what's going to happen when I post the form. So at the minute I've got two functions with the exact same name. I've got login and I've got login. So what I need to do is attach what's called a data annotation to these functions now, so that it knows which one to run and when. So to do that, I'm going to go right to the top of the file, and I'm going to add in using system.component model, and then .data annotations. And you can see it remains grayed out, and that's because we're not using it just now. So we are going to go back down, and now what we're going to do is annotate these functions, or what's called annotate the functions or methods. So on this first one, which is login, what we're going to do is we're going to add an annotation to say that this is only going to be displayed on a get. So what I mean by get is we're not going to post information to it, we're not going to ask it to do anything, we're just going to display it. So on here we need to add in some square brackets, and we're going to say HTTP get like so. And that's now our function annotated. So I'm going to just add some comments just so I know what's happening here. So this is loaded when we visit login URL. And then this next one, we only want to use this when we're hitting the post button, so when we're trying to log in. So in here in square brackets, I'm going to say HTTP post. Now because I'm going to be adding my authentication system, I'm just going to annotate this with an allow anonymous. If I can spell. So you can see I've added in an annotation which says allow anonymous. Now the reason why I'm adding this is just to keep the code clear for myself, but what it means is that if I do decide to lock up any of these pages to anyone that isn't logged in, then I can still get to the login function itself. So I'm going to add in what it's asking me to do, which is to add in the ASP.NET Core authorization element. That's going to rectify that. Now I'm also going to add this onto the login view itself. In this case, what we're doing is we're checking that they're logged in, but we're not doing anything if they don't actually log in. So if they don't post something or they send a blank post, which for all intents and purposes you should be catching anyway to stop any unneeded post requests to your server. So in here, all we're going to do is return the view if they don't log in. Again, that's just going to show our login form for us. I'm also just going to tweak my redirect just slightly because I've actually put the wrong type of surroundings in here. It should be speech marks, not single quotes, and that will now fix that error for us as well. Now that I've done that, I'm going to go back into my admin controller, and in here I'm going to add in a data annotation. Now the annotation is going to prompt anyone who tries to access this controller to log in. So I'm going to protect the whole controller. So I'm going to show you two different ways you can do this. So in square brackets, we're going to add the word authorize. That now means if I try and access anything within this controller, that it's going to prompt me to log in. Alternatively, what I can do is I can pop this against each and every or each method that I want to protect. So in this case, I'm only going to protect the index function. Now, for the purpose of this example, we're going to protect the whole controller. So now if I run my application, what we'll see is that I can access all public areas still. So I can still access my login form, I can still access everything within authentication, and I can still get here. So welcome to the Authentication Controller. Now I'm going to try and log in, and I can get to my login form. Now what's going to happen is it is going to give me an error, and we're going to go back and fix that, but I'm just going to show you what that error is. So the error that it's going to give us is when I now try and go to admin, which I know is going to be password protected due to that authorized annotation that I just added, it's going to give me an error. Now, a good thing to get used to is reading these errors. So you can see very clearly it says that no authentication scheme was specified and there is no default challenge scheme found. So what that means is it knows that we need to authenticate a user to get into here, but it doesn't know what to do with them. So we're going to go ahead and set that up next. So we're going to go ahead and close our application, and then we're going to go down into this right hand side. So this is our Solution Explorer, and we're going to look for our startup.cs file, and this is where we're going to make our next set of changes, which is going to set up that challenge. So in here we're looking for a configure services method, which is here. So inside this, what we're going to do is we're now going to prompt the system to send us somewhere when we need to log in. So in this case, it's going to be our authentication and our login function or login method within that. So underneath our database context, what I'm going to do is say services dot add, and it's going to be authentication. We're going to say cookie authentication defaults. And then we're going to add an authentication scheme. We're going to use this to add a cookie. And we're going to give this cookie some options. Okay, so inside these curly braces, we're going to set what's called a login path. So this is what's going to happen when we need to log in. So it's going to send us somewhere. So we're going to set this to our controller and our method where we're prompting our users to log in. So in this case, we know quite well that it's the Authentication Controller. So we start off with the controller name, followed by the method or the function name, which in this case is login. You can see we've got an error on our cookies authentication default, so we're going to click this light bulb and we're going to go down and add in cookie authentication defaults, like so, and that's going to fix it for us. Now what I am going to do, because I'm not too happy with how this is formatted in terms of how it's readable in terms of code, it's a very long line. I'm going to use this light bulb symbol here again to apply some wrapping. So I'm going to click that, go down to wrapping, and I'm going to wrap and align a call chain. So we can see that it's now dropped it on 2 lines. It's just a bit easier to read. Now that we've done that, we've actually set up our challenge. So I'm going to comment this just saying set up the challenge scheme. And again, this is going to tell our application where to send users when they need to be authenticated. In this example, I'm trying to access the admin controller, which is completely under lock and key at the moment. Now that I've got that added in, I need to go into my configure function, which is just below. On line 58 we have our app.use authorization. What we also need to add into here is app.use authentication. It's a very similar naming, however authentication is going to use our login form to carry out the login process. So again, back to our home page. I'm going to show you that everywhere still works properly. So we're going to go to the Authentication Controller. Again, fine, we can view that. We're going to go to the login screen, which again, fine, we can view that. Now we're going to try and access the admin controller. Okay, and you can see nothing's changed in terms of screen, but it has redirected, so you can see return URL is from admin and it sent us to authentication or login. So just to show you that happening again, I'm now on my store's home page. I want to go into the administration area and you can see it now prompts me to log in. The important thing to recognise here is we haven't done anything special with the authentication. We haven't asked it to encrypt the password, but what we are doing is checking that that record exists and that the data we enter matches. I'm going to just stop my application just very quickly just to make sure that we've got a user and a password in that database. So I'm going to close the browser, and then remember on the left hand side we've got our SQL Server Object Explorer. I'm going to click onto this and we're going to check our local database, so our MS SQL local DB. Our database is our store database. We're just going to see what data we've got in there, so we're going to right click on the table name and click view data. And in there we've got nothing in there, so I'm just going to add one just very quickly. We are going to go through creating and adding this data into this database through the application, but for now I just want to check the login system. So that's now my user in the database, so I'm just going to close that and show you that that's saved. So I'm going to right click on the table again, I'm going to click view data, and you can see I get my username Mark and my password, which is just password. Again, this is plain text. You would need to encrypt this on a live application, and we will go through the encryption of this in a later video. Now that I've got that, I'm going to run my application and I'm going to try and access the admin controller once more. Now remember, we did adjust the view for the admin controller, so I'll just go in and just very quickly show you that. And what we said was welcome to the admin area. So we should get a view which is very plain, but it will say welcome to the admin area, so we can see that we're actually logged in at this point. So back here, we're going to go to /admin, which is going to prompt us to log in. Username in this case is Mark, password is password. I'm going to click login. So unfortunately at the moment I'm getting an error, so you can see how I've got my white screen here, and you can see that it's redirecting me to somewhere totally random in this case, which if we just go back and check our code in our login form, we'll realise this isn't random, it's actually a mistake that I've made earlier on in this video. So we're going to go back into Visual Studio, we're going to stop our application running in the background just now. We're going to go back into our login form and we're just going to change this section here. So this is where we're processing the login. So I've actually typed administration here when it shouldn't be administration, it should be authentication, because that's the controller which is handling the login. So we've just added in this extra line of code using again razor syntax indicated by this @ symbol, which is an anti-forgery token. Now this anti-forgery token, it allows us to stop cross-site request forgery. So what that means is another website submitting to this form. So now that we've got that in place, we're going to save this template file, we're going to rerun our app. We're going to go back to the admin controller, which is going to prompt us to log in again. So /admin brings us to login form. We're going to log in. So I'm going to pop in my username, which is Mark, and my password, and I'm going to click login. Before we can process our login, we need to tweak our model ever so slightly to add in an indicator of which column in that table is the key. So we're going to open up our users model. We're going to add to the top of this file our data annotation using file again. So we're going to say using system dot component model dot data annotations, and then what we're going to do is in square brackets above our unique identifier or key, in this case it's our user ID, we're going to add square brackets key with a capital K like so. Okay, so we're running our application again, so let's try and log in. So we're going to go to /admin, pop in the username Mark, and then the password. Click login. Now we're going to see there's another error here, and it's actually something that I showed you in the last tutorial, so we're going to go back and tweak that now in our database. Now the reason why is because this text field is actually deprecated, so we're going to tweak this just ever so slightly to get this to work again for us. So the first thing we're going to do is close our application. We're going to go back into our SQL Server Object Explorer. We're going to edit our users table, so we're going to right click on the table and click View Designer. We're going to change this field type here to varchar, and then in our brackets we're going to put the word max in. And you can see that that's actually in the drop down for us as well. And then we're going to click update, and then we're going to update the database from that script, and you can see it's running it here, and you can see it's now been completed, and we get update complete successfully. We can now run our app again. And then once it's loaded up, we're going to try and access that admin controller again, which should prompt us for our username and password. So /admin, we're going to try and log in, so Mark and the password. We can now see that I'm in the admin area. Now if I pop back to just the main website, you can see I'm back at the home page, just welcome. I'm just going to show you that we can retain this login. So now when I go to admin, it's not going to ask me to log in. It's kept the fact that we're logged in because we've stored that in a cookie. So to show that we actually have a login cookie here, I'm going to click on the hamburger menu in Firefox Developer. I'm going to go to Web Developer, and I'm going to click on Storage Inspector. Now that, as you can see, is bringing up our cookies here. Now what I can do is I can right click on each of these cookies, and I'm going to click to delete them. Okay, so I'm going to close the inspector. I'm going to reopen the inspector, and we can see that we now have no cookies there. For some reason you should be able to refresh this cookie area, but for some reason in Firefox Developer it doesn't seem to refresh straight away. So that's the reason why I went out of there, closed it and reopened the storage inspector again. Now if I navigate to my admin area again, you can see once again it's prompting me to log in. So I'm just going to log in to show you this. So I've logged in. I can now see in real time that it's created this new cookie. Now we can see that the time it's been created is 14:54 seconds. So that's today, 2:40 PM. Obviously now we're on 3:40, but the time on the server is just an hour out. Okay, so that's our cookie being created for us. So the next step for us to do is to make sure that we can actually destroy this ourselves without having to ask a user to go into this cookies area in any of their web browsers. So for that we're going to create a logout function. For the purposes of this video, we're not going to be creating any sort of link to the logout function. We're just going to expect the user to enter it into their web browser. Now obviously in a real life application, to have a link or a logout button somewhere in the application to make things easy for them. So I'm going to show you how to create the function. So we're going to go back into our Visual Studio. We're going to go into the Authentication Controller. So we'll just get rid of views for now and minimize it. Minimize models, and we'll get rid of data as well. We're going to go into the Authentication Controller, and in here we're going to add a new function. So I'll just remove some of this spacing. There we go, now that's a bit tidier. So we're going to add an additional function here. Now we're going to need to make sure that the user is logged in before they can hit the logout link. Doesn't particularly matter, but again, why accept a request that we don't need to happen? So we're going to start off by adding the annotation called Authorize, and then we're going to write our function. So we're going to create an asynchronous task. We're looking for a result to come from this task, and we're just going to call it logout. So this is how we're going to access it in our web browser. So that's now the basis of my function. Now what we're going to say is that we need to log out, so the asynchronous part of this is we're waiting for a response. So we're going to wait for the logout to actually occur, and we're going to say http context dot sign out async. And you can see the Visual Studio IDE has prompted me all the way along there to create that action. Once they're logged out, just to show what actually happens once they're logged out, is we're going to redirect them back to an action, which is just one of our method names or function names in our controller, and we're going to redirect them back to login so we can see that they're actually being prompted to log in. Now because we're in the same controller, we don't need to prefix this with a controller name, So usually what we need to do when we're redirecting is we need to say authentication /login. Now redirect to action is slightly different because we're redirecting to an action within this controller, in which case we're going to redirect to login, which will show our login form again. So now if I run this, I'm going to navigate to the admin controller again. So it's prompted me to log in, so I'm going to pop in my username and password. And you can see I'm now logged in. So I can go back to the home page, I can go to admin, and again I can go back and forward as much as I want. I'm retaining that cookie. Now to log out, I'm going to access the Authentication Controller, which is where I've written my logout function, and I'm going to type authentication, again that's the controller name, /logout, which is a function to log me out. And you can see I'm now presented with the login screen again, which is where I'd asked it to redirect previously. Now just to show you this has actually worked, I'm going to change that URL and put /admin on the end, and again we can see it brings us back to the login screen. That's it then for today's tutorial. I was hoping to go through adding and removing users and also editing their user information within this tutorial, but as we get into a certain time period I've decided I'm going to split that into a separate tutorial. So at the end of today's tutorial what we've achieved is we have a login system which interacts with our database and checks both the username and password. Thanks for watching today. Remember to subscribe and like this video.